Many of you recognize this classic synthesizer effect. It's a sample and hold, or what some people may refer to as a stepped random voltage. Its voltage output is displayed up here in green on the data oscilloscope, driving the pitch of an oscillator, creating these random tones. Now this is the classic sci-fi effect. Musically, I use sample and holds or their relatives quite a bit to add a little bit more articulation to my notes. For example, I may take the output, instead of going to the pitch of the oscillator, instead go to the cutoff of the filter, lower a little bit so we hear its effect. Maybe bring in a second oscillator and make it fuller. And I like how those random accents just make it sound a little bit more like a human is deciding to play each note a little bit differently rather than with machine-like precision. However, there are alternatives to the classic sample and hold that might be a bit more subtle in application or far more controllable. So let's go through a few of those. I'm going to turn down the reverb a little bit so you can hear things more clearly. Get my second oscillator out of here, cut off back up again. And let's first look at the DivKid SSF random step. This is one of my favorite modules. I have one in both my live system and in my studio system. It's 3 sample and holds, each one with a bipolar and a unipolar output. And they behave a little bit differently than the classic sample and hold. I'll take my clock and plug it into the trigger of one of the stages, and I will take the voltage output initially from the bipolar output. Now what's different about the random step is the way it distributes the voltages. Rather than being evenly distributed to anywhere among its plus to minus range, instead it uses what's called a bell curve, a Gaussian distribution, which says the middle, around 0 volts, is where most of the voltages are going to sit, and fewer of them will be on the outliers at the high plus or minus voltages. I'll patch it down here to pitch. You hear the range is a little bit less wild, and it tends to stick a little bit more here in the middle, with just this occasional outlier, like that low negative spike there. But it tends to be a little bit more centered, which I think again is a bit more typical of a musician who won't do a wild variation every single note. They'll throw them in less often. Now what's particularly interesting about the random step is the unipolar output, positive only. Instead of being just a scaled and offset version of the bipolar, what it does is it chops off all of the negative excursions. That means roughly half of the samples are 0 volts, and just some of them, well half of them namely, are going to be above 0 volts, with the same distribution of most being close to 0, just the occasional spike. And again, when I apply that to a parameter, say, such as filter cutoff, I find it more natural. So I'm just going to move it down here again to the filter, lower the cutoff. And now you're hearing just an occasional accent come in. I'll bring up the second oscillator. To me, that's a little bit more natural if I'm just trying to imitate a human's occasional accents, as opposed to having something completely random going all the time. I use that a lot on different parameters, filter cutoffs, different parameters for percussion modules, wave folder depths, all sorts of things like that. Next, let's look at the Mutable Instruments marbles. I have a full-size version of this in my studio system, and one of the clones, the Caro one, in my portable live system. This is a very deep, flexible module. I've done videos on it before, but I'm going to give a brief overview of it here and particularly show you what parameters to set on it. What marbles is a series of 3 clocked triggers and 3 voltages that follow them. These triggers can be all sorts of different things, such as multiplications and divisions of a main clock, a coin flip like branches of one or the other, or very simple kick and snare patterns. The middle one, T2, tends to be one that's a steady pulse based on the rate control or the external clock pulse. X1, 2, and 3 are stepped random voltages that are refreshed every time there's a trigger on T1, 2, or 3. Again, X2 would be the one that happens on every single clock, like T2, and X1 and X3 will happen whenever these variations, T1 and T3, fire off. Bias and jitter don't come into play for these tests. Leave rate at 12 o'clock, because that means there'll be a 1-for-1 copy of our incoming clock, which I'll go ahead and patch in now. Set length to 4 initially, because I want to demonstrate exactly what it means. Put steps at noon, as well as spread and bias, all 3 of those. Put Deja Vu, full counterclockwise initially. And here's our voltage spread too. It can be plus or minus 5 volts, just 0 to 2 volts, or 0 to 5 volts. I'm going to keep it in the 0 to 5 range initially, but it is nice that Marbles has a variable output range to help you better match what a module might expect without requiring an attenuator. Marbles also has a smooth output, the Y, which follows the clock rate. I'll go ahead and have it control pitch again. I'll turn on my second oscillator, turn on my filter, get rid of the resonance, and you'll hear that it's basically just a smooth random voltage that goes up and down. And again, that follows the rate. I'll go ahead and multiply the clock for faster, or divide my clock for slower. But for now, I'm going to focus on the X2 output. Now with these initial settings that I've given you, you're going to get very much a sample and hold type output where everything's very, very random. There's a few ways of modifying that pattern. One is the steps control. If you take it to the left of noon, you start to slew in between those steps. Once you get to an extreme counterclockwise, it basically turns it into another smooth random voltage. Now, what's particularly interesting about steps, and the way that a lot of people use it, is that you rotate it past noon, it goes from being completely random voltages to being semitones. A bit more musical. And there is a way of using this button up here to change what the musical scale is. I'll just show you quickly that you hold it for a long press until it starts blinking, and you go between different scales. Including major, the flashing green, and minor, the flashing yellow, which is what I'm using. Now the further you turn steps clockwise, the more it's going to focus on root notes, for example Cs. Now you hear where we're getting mostly octave jumps. I'll back it off here somewhere in the middle to get somewhat even distribution. Now spread also controls what sort of distribution we're getting of the notes. Noon says, give us our widest distribution. As I go further towards the left, counterclockwise, it's restricting the distribution, focusing more and more on that center line. Not variations on C, which is what steps did, but getting us all the way to our middle C and staying there. Until I turn it up. And now we're trying to get some variations. Now we're getting wider range of variations. And now maximum variation. As I push spread further clockwise, it starts pushing that distribution out towards the edges. So rather than focusing on one note, it starts to focus on the extreme notes. It pushes away from the center. A little bit more in the way of high and low notes there. More so. Until we're just the highest and lowest octaves. So I really like the flexibility of this to say how extreme things like my pitch, or for that matter, my filter cutoff is going to be. From being nice distribution of random voltages, down to no distribution at all, almost becomes like a depth control at that point, until we push to extremes. I'll put it back here in the middle for now. Now what bias does is say, where do we lean these voltages? Do we bias them towards lower values or bias them towards higher values? Right now, we have the widest distribution centered around our middle voltage, which is about 2.5 volts. As I start biasing negative, get a little bit more in the way of the low values, but some of the high values still come through. So I push it further and further and get more predominantly the low notes. You can see how it compares to that blue line, which is 0 volts. And then finally all the way down, just the occasional extreme note, kind of similar to what we were getting out of random step. Then you can turn bias in the other direction and say, hey, maybe I want to focus on higher notes or higher cutoffs in this case. Finally, extreme, mainly higher values. I'll pull it back to the center for now. Now, another one of the features that's very interesting about marbles, and the reason some people use it melodically, is this deja vu control. It basically says how random are going to be the notes or the pitches or the voltages being output. Full counterclockwise is maximum random. Let us get back to keyboard for now, where we're playing pitch. And let's take deja vu up all the way to noon, and you know you're at noon when these two LEDs start blinking. It says you're locked in. And now you hear we're locked on a 4-note pattern. I can change the length of the pattern down to, say, 2 steps, to 6, but I'll go to 4 for now. As you push deja vu clockwise, it says keep those same 4-note values, but play around with the order they appear in. So just a little bit clockwise. You notice these have stopped blinking. We'll start getting more variations the more I push clockwise. To the point where we're changing the order of those 4 notes all the time. Go back to noon, where it's the same 4 notes. Now, as I pull deja vu the other direction, counterclockwise, it says throw in some random values every now and then. Just a little bit to the left of noon, and we'll get the occasional new note thrown in. And if you have a sequence you like, you can trap it. Keep that going. Come back counterclockwise to get some new variations. Lock that in. Or the further you turn, the more often it's going to swap in new notes. Till you're completely random. Let's just go for occasional variations for now. So you see where this gives you a lot of control over how the notes are being played. I'll go back to filter cutoff for now. Let's go ahead and add in a second oscillator. I can have this fairly wide spread of random values. I can say have very little spread, or even just stay to the same cutoff in this case, with just some variations. Bias negative if I want it to be darker, close my filter cutoff. Bias positive if I want the filter open more. Go back to maximum distribution. Say give me full distribution of all the different values. Or just go to the extremes. Maybe bias that down a little bit. So it's really quite an expressive sample and hold with a lot of different controls over how it outputs different values, including deja vu if you want a repetitive pattern. So I basically have a 4-step pattern there. Let's go ahead and make some like 6 steps. And then set up a 4-note sequence. So 4 notes against a 6-note pattern on the filter cutoff creates a nice traveling sort of effect. I'll go back to 1 note for now. And that's marbles. Finally, we have the Frap Tools Sapel Tamed Random Source. It's an evolution of the classic Buchla Source of Uncertainty module. And you'll find some similarities between it and marbles, although they have different approaches to creating smooth, stepped, and tuned random voltages. There's 2 completely different sections that are identical, the yellow section and the green section. You can have them cross-pollinate where one's clock also triggers the other side. That's these 2 little tiny buttons here next to the center knobs. If they're by the color dot, That means that they'll take some triggers from the other side as well. For now, I'm going to leave both of these away from the colored dots, saying they're working completely independently from each other. I'll go back down to my one VCO voice, turn up the filter a little bit so you can hear the oscillator a bit clearer, move the clock over to the clock input for the yellow Sapel voice, and I'll patch into the smooth random output for starters. Now, good initial settings for Sapel is to take these top two controls, which are basically semitones and octaves, and put them full clockwise for now. This control is for the smooth random. I'm going to start it in the middle, but we can play games with that later on. I'm going to take all three of these little switches with the little yellow triangles, push them far right. That means this distribution control, which I'm starting at 12 noon, which is very similar to the bias control on marbles, will affect the voltage ranges of those outputs. And finally, this is the clock speed when I'm not externally clocking. I have it turned all the way down, but it doesn't matter since we are using an external clock. Now, I mentioned it does have this smooth random output, and I'll go ahead and start up the keyboard so you can hear all those random voltages moving around. This control is basically how noisy or how busy this smooth random is. From extremely busy and crazy to very slow evolutions. Nice little variations there. And that's a good moderate speed in the middle. Now this little jack here, with no knob associated with it, is a classic sample and hold, which means it's completely random voltages, not tuned to semitones or octaves. And you can get the random nature of that there. By the way, Sapel only has a positive voltage range. I'll move up to the top jack, which is semitones, and now you hear it being tuned. It does not have the scale control that marbles has, but you can always feed it into a quantizer if you do want to conform it to a particular scale. It does have some other things going for it, which we'll get to in a minute. And then the next jack down are just octaves. So separate outputs for the semitones and octaves as opposed to playing around with steps or spread to get to those values. Now, one of my favorite things about Sapel is this distribution or bias control. Very similar to bias over here on marbles, it says, do we lean towards lower values or towards higher values? I'll go to semitones again, turn bias all the way down, and you see we tend to hang towards those lower notes. Turn bias up. Now it's focusing on the higher outputs. And again, if I want to disconnect this particular output from this distribution, I just turn this little switch to the left. Now it's just following its maximum range. But I'll put it back here to follow bias because I use this as a performance control. In fact, let's go ahead and patch this back over to the filter cutoff. Bring up that second oscillator again. So I can play games like section in the music where maybe I want it to be a more muted filter. Put distribution all the way down. And then if I want to open the filter up, I turn distribution clockwise. So that's something that I'll adjust while I'm playing. Now these two controls are very interesting because they affect the math going on inside Sapel. Basically how many different octaves or how many different semitones to go ahead and choose. And this is based on Buchtel's original idea. Let's go down to octaves. This control is basically how many octaves range do we have. It's expressed by the math of basically n plus. So I turn this all the way down here to 0. We're only going to get this one value, the 0 volt line. If I turn it up to what's roughly 1 on a scale of 1 to 6, or 0 to 6, now you see we're just getting 0 line or 1 octave up, 1 volt. And how much I turn this is a little bit of a distribution control. Favors low values, starts to favor higher values. So it is continuous rather than being a discrete 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 control. Turn it up a little bit higher. Now we introduce that second value. So we basically have 0, 1, and 2 for our octaves. And keep turning this up to get an ever-increasing range of octaves. And we go to maximum if we want to. And of course, this does interact with the distribution controller. Bring it down here to where we just have a couple values going. Turn the distribution clockwise or positive. That's going to favor those higher values. Turn distribution to the left, counterclockwise. Now again, it's favoring the low values, even if I've got this turned maybe to where it might bias towards a higher value. There we go. Back up to full range. The semitone control is even more advanced or has more options. It's basically n squared, where this knob is n. If I turn n down to 0 full counterclockwise, well, 0 squared is 1 value. As I turn it up, we'll start getting some subtle variations. You'll see just some very small bumps here and just hear some small changes going on in the filtering. I'll turn up resonance so you can hear it clearly. As I turn this up more, I get more and more values in the mix. So it starts around 0 and then increases values in positive voltage as I turn this up. But again, I can lean it using the distribution or bias control. So not quite the same as the Deja Vu and the length over on marbles, which is very much for creating sequences. But Sapel does give you control over what range of values you're going to get, and how many different values you'll find. As you can imagine, the octave output in particular is very useful with a precision adder. Just do various octave jumps. Just step at every note of the sequence and introduce different octaves based on this control. Even with the filter cutoff, you can hear, even though I just have 4 notes playing, they're articulated differently. And those are my favorite alternatives to a sample and hold. I mean, sample and holds are fun, but they are a bit mindless, to be honest. Kind of a blunt weapon. I like these other tools that give me more control over the nature and the distribution of my random voltages, particularly ones I can use as performance controls, or just use to go ahead and say, do what a musician might do, throw in the occasional accent.